Maria stood at the entrance of Fort Military Academy, her worn duffel bag clutched tightly in her calloused hands. The September morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and diesel fuel from the nearby motor pool. At 19, she was smaller than most recruits, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her dark eyes burned with a determination that had carried her through the toughest neighborhoods of East Los Angeles. The other recruits towered over her as they filed through the gates. Most came from military families or suburban backgrounds where college wasn't a distant dream but an expectation. Maria came from a place where surviving to 18 was an achievement worth celebrating. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table after Maria's father disappeared when she was 12. The military represented more than a career choice for Maria. It was her escape route from a cycle of poverty that had trapped generations of her family. "Move it, recruit!" Drill sergeant's voice boomed across the courtyard. His weathered face had seen 25 years of breaking down civilians and building soldiers. Maria quickened her pace, falling in line with the other new arrivals. The first thing she noticed was how the other recruits seemed to naturally form small groups, chatting about their and families. She remained silent, observing everything with the street-smart awareness that had kept her safe growing up. The first week of basic training was a blur of early morning wake-up calls, endless push-ups, and learning to make her bunk so tight a quarter would bounce off it. Maria excelled at the physical challenges. Years of walking miles to school, helping her mother carry groceries up 4 flights of stairs, and working part-time jobs had given her a stamina that surprised even her drill instructors. But it was during weapons training that Maria truly began to stand out. Sergeant First Class Williams, a soft-spoken man from Alabama, noticed how quickly she mastered the M16 rifle. While other recruits struggled with the mechanics and accuracy, Maria seemed to have an intuitive understanding of ballistics and weapon maintenance. Her scores at the firing range consistently topped the class. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Williams asked one afternoon as Maria disassembled and cleaned her weapon with mechanical precision. "My uncle took me hunting when I was younger, Sergeant," she replied, not mentioning that those hunting trips were actually late-night expeditions to catch rabbits and birds to supplement their meager food supplies. The social dynamics of basic training proved more challenging than the physical demands. Many of the other female recruits came from backgrounds where they had been encouraged to pursue leadership roles in school and community activities. They spoke confidently in group discussions and seemed comfortable challenging authority when appropriate. Maria had learned early to keep her head down and avoid drawing attention to herself. Private Jessica, a woman from Connecticut whose father was a Navy admiral, seemed particularly puzzled by Maria's quiet demeanor. During their second week, she approached Maria during evening free time. "Hey, you're really good at all this military stuff," Jessica said, sitting on the edge of Maria's bunk. "How come you never speak up during leadership exercises?" Maria continued folding her uniforms with precise military corners, "Just focusing on doing my job right." "But you could help the rest of us. Sergeant Williams obviously thinks you have potential." Maria looked up from her folding. "Where I come from, standing out isn't always a good thing." Jessica's expression softened with understanding. "This isn't where you come from anymore." That conversation planted a seed in Maria's mind, though it would take time to grow. She began to notice how the drill instructors responded differently to recruits who showed initiative versus those who simply followed orders. The military, she realized, rewarded a different kind of behavior than the streets had taught her. The turning point came during their 4th week. The platoon was participating in a field exercise designed to test their ability to work as a unit under pressure. They had been divided into 2 squads and given a mission to secure a mock enemy position. Maria's squad was led by Private First Class David, a college graduate who had enrolled in officer candidate school. The exercise went badly from the start. Its plan was overly complicated and fell apart when they encountered unexpected resistance from the opposing squad. Half of Maria's squad was killed in the first 10 minutes, including himself. The remaining members looked around confused, unsure how to proceed. Maria found herself studying the terrain with the same intensity she had once used to navigate gang territories. She could see 3 possible routes to the objective, each with its own risks and advantages. For a moment, she hesitated, hearing her mother's voice warning her to never put herself in a position where others could tear her down. Then she remembered Jessica's words, "This isn't where you come from anymore." Listen up, Maria said quietly, gathering the remaining squad members. We can still complete this mission, but we need to move fast and work together. She outlined a simple plan that used the natural cover of the training area to approach the enemy position from an unexpected angle. Her teammates looked skeptical. She was the smallest and quietest member of their group, but something in her tone convinced them to listen. 20 minutes later, they had successfully captured the objective while the other squad was still debating their next move. The drill instructors watching from a nearby hill exchanged impressed glances as they observed Maria's squad execute their mission with military precision. After the exercise, Sergeant pulled Maria aside. Good thinking out there. Ever consider applying for leadership training? Maria felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. I'm not sure I'm leadership material, Sergeant. Studied her with experienced eyes. Let me tell you something, recruit. I've been training soldiers for more than 2 decades. I can spot natural leadership from a mile away, and you've got it. The question is whether you're going to waste it by playing it safe. That night, Maria lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling while her bunkmates slept around her. She thought about her mother working the overnight shift at the hospital laundry, her younger brother Carlos trying to stay out of trouble in the neighborhood where college wasn't even discussed as a possibility. She thought about Jessica's confidence and the way the other recruits naturally looked to her for guidance. Most of all, she thought about Sergeant's words. Was she wasting something valuable by trying to remain invisible? The next morning brought news that would change everything. The battalion was being visited by a group of senior officers evaluating the training program. Among them was Colonel Hayes, one of the highest-ranking women in the Army and a legend among female soldiers. Maria had read about Colonel Hayes in the military magazines available in the base library, a woman who had fought her way up through the ranks at a time when female soldiers faced even greater challenges than they did today. As the senior officers toured the training facilities, Maria's platoon was selected to demonstrate various skills and exercises. When they reached the weapons training range, Sergeant Williams called Maria forward to demonstrate proper rifle maintenance and marksmanship. Standing before the group of colonels and generals, Maria felt every eye focused on her small frame. She could hear whispers about her age and size, but she forced herself to focus on the familiar weight of the rifle in her hands. She field-stripped the weapon, cleaned each component, and reassembled it in record time. Then she moved to the firing line and put 10 consecutive rounds through the center of a target at 300 yards. The officers murmured their approval, but it was Colonel Hayes who stepped forward to speak with her personally. What's your name, soldier? Private, ma'am. Where are you from, Private? East Los Angeles, ma'am. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly. I grew up in South Chicago. I know something about proving yourself in environments where people don't expect you to succeed. Maria met the colonel's eyes and saw something she recognized, the look of someone who had fought for every opportunity and never taken anything for granted. What are your plans after basic training? Colonel Hayes asked. Infantry training, then hopefully deployment overseas, ma'am. Have you considered officer candidate school? The question hit Maria like a physical blow. Officer candidate school was for people like Jessica, people with college degrees and family connections, and the confidence to believe they deserve to lead others. I don't think I'm qualified, ma'am. Colonel Hayes smiled slightly. Private, qualification isn't just about where you come from or what's on paper. It's about character, intelligence, and the ability to make good decisions under pressure. From what I've observed today, you have all 3 in abundance. She handed Maria her business card. Think about it. The Army needs leaders who understand what it means to fight for something bigger than themselves. As the senior officers moved on to the next demonstration, Maria stared down at the card in her trembling hand. Colonel Hayes, United States Army. Below her name was a phone number and an email address. That evening, Maria called her mother from the pay phone outside the barracks. His voice was tired but warm as she asked about training and whether Maria was eating enough. Mama, Maria said carefully, there's an opportunity here, a chance to become an officer. The line was quiet for a long moment. What does that mean? It means more responsibility, more training, and eventually the chance to lead other soldiers. It also means standing out more, doesn't it? His voice carried 20 years of hard-won wisdom. Being the one others watch and judge. Yes, Mama, it means that. Another pause. You remember what I used to tell you and Carlos when you were little, about how some people are born to follow the path others make, and some people are born to make the path for others to follow. Maria remembered. It was something her mother said whenever Maria showed exceptional grades or stood up to neighborhood bullies picking on smaller children. I remembered. I always knew you were born to make the path, Maria. I was just hoping you would be safe until you were strong enough to handle what comes with it. When Maria hung up the phone, she felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of the protective shell she had built around her ambitions. For the first time since arriving at Fort, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond simply surviving and getting by. The next morning, she knocked on Sergeant's office door. Enter. Maria stepped inside and came to attention. Sergeant, I would like to request information about Officer Candidate School, Sergeant. Looked up from his paperwork with a slight smile. It's about time. I was starting to think you were going to waste all that potential. He pulled out a thick packet of forms and requirements. Fair warning, recruit, OCS isn't just about being smart or tough. They're going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed. They're going to test not just what you can do, but who you are when everything is on the line. Mario accepted the packet with steady hands. I understand, Sergeant. Do you? Leaned back in his chair. Because once you start down this path, there's no going back to being invisible. Officers don't get to hide in the back and hope nobody notices them. You'll be responsible for the lives and welfare of other soldiers. That's a weight that changes you. Maria thought about her conversation with her mother, about Colonel Hayes's knowing look, about Jessica's easy confidence. She thought about her brother Carlos and the neighborhood where dreams went to die, and about the possibility that she might be able to create opportunities for others the way this one had been created for her. I'm ready for that responsibility, Sergeant. Nodded approvingly. Then let's get started. You've got a lot of work ahead of you. As Maria left the sergeant's office, packet of OCS application materials tucked under her arm, she felt the weight of a decision that would reshape not just her own future, but potentially the futures of all the soldiers she would someday lead. The quiet girl from East Los Angeles was beginning to understand that true strength sometimes meant stepping into the light, regardless of who might be waiting to tear her down. 2 years after graduating from Officer Candidate School, Second Lieutenant Maria found herself standing in the briefing room of Forward Operating Base Courage in Afghanistan. The morning sun cast long shadows through the reinforced windows, and the air smelled of dust, diesel fuel, and the strong coffee that kept everyone functioning on 3 hours of sleep. At 23, she commanded a platoon of 32 soldiers, most of whom were older and more experienced than she was. Her promotion to first lieutenant had come faster than expected, largely due to her exceptional performance during a complex humanitarian mission in a disputed region of Kandahar province. Listen up, everyone, Captain James, Jessica's older brother, called the meeting to order. Maria had been surprised to discover the family connection when she arrived at her first deployment, but James had proven to be a fair and competent commanding officer who evaluated his subordinates based on merit rather than personal relationships. The mission briefing outlined their next assignment: escorting a convoy of medical supplies to a remote village that had been cut off from aid for 3 months due to increased insurgent activity in the region. Intelligence reports suggested the route was relatively clear, but everyone in the room knew how quickly situations could deteriorate in this part of Afghanistan. Captain said, "Your platoon will take point. Martinez will provide rear security, and Williams will handle communications and logistics." Lieutenant Carlos Martinez, a veteran officer from Texas, raised his hand. "Sir, wouldn't it make more sense for to take rear security? Her platoon has the least combat experience." Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever her capabilities were questioned, but she kept her expression neutral. Over the past 2 years, she had learned to let her actions speak louder than any defensive words. "Negative," Captain replied firmly. "Lieutenant's platoon has demonstrated excellent tactical awareness and unit cohesion. They're the right choice for point position." After the briefing, Maria gathered her squad leaders for their own planning session. Sergeant First Class Michael, her senior non-commissioned officer, spread a detailed map across the table in their makeshift conference area. "The road looks clear for the first 15 clicks," he said, tracing the route with his finger. But this stretch here between the two, that's where I'd set up an ambush if I were trying to stop a convoy. Maria studied the map intently. Was a 15-year veteran who had initially been skeptical of taking orders from someone young enough to be his daughter. Their working relationship had evolved slowly, built on mutual respect earned through shared hardships and Maria's willingness to listen to his experience while making her own informed decisions. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "Send a scout team ahead to check the high ground. If there's anyone up there watching the road, we'll know before we commit the entire convoy to that stretch." Staff Sergeant, Maria's second-in-command, and one of only 3 women in the platoon, nodded agreement. "I can take a team up the eastern ridge while Jackson takes the western approach." Maria considered the options. The conservative approach would be to request air support to clear the area, but helicopter assets were limited and usually reserved for higher priority missions. The aggressive approach would be to push through quickly and rely on speed to minimize exposure. The middle ground was suggestion, careful reconnaissance that would delay the convoy but potentially save lives. "Do it," Maria decided. "Takes east, Jackson takes west. We'll hold the convoy at Checkpoint Alpha until you give us the all-clear." 3 hours later, they learned why Maria's cautious approach had been the right choice. His team discovered a 6-man insurgent observation post on the eastern ridge, perfectly positioned to coordinate an ambush in the valley below. The insurgents had apparently been watching the road for days, waiting for a high-value target like their medical convoy. Rather than simply calling in, Maria made a decision that would later be studied in military academies as an example of innovative tactical thinking. She coordinated a simultaneous approach from 3 directions, using her platoon's superior numbers and training to capture the entire insurgent cell alive. The interrogation of the captured insurgents revealed intelligence about a larger network of positions threatening supply routes throughout the region. Maria's decision to preserve the enemies rather than eliminate them had yielded information that would save dozens of American and coalition lives over the following months. Captain's after-action report praised Maria's exceptional tactical judgment and innovative problem-solving under pressure. But it was the response from her own soldiers that meant the most to her. That evening, as they set up their defensive perimeter at the village where they had delivered the medical supplies, approached her privately. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology," the gruff sergeant said, his Irish accent thickened by emotion. "When they assigned me to your platoon, I figured I'd be babysitting some college kid playing soldier. I was wrong." Maria looked up from the intelligence report she was writing. "You never made me feel unwelcome, Sergeant." "Maybe not openly, but I know I questioned your decisions more than I should have. Today proved what I should have seen months ago. You're not just competent, you're exceptional. This platoon is lucky to have you." The recognition from a man whose approval she had worked for months to earn felt more valuable than any official commendation. But Maria was learning that success brought its own challenges. Word of her tactical innovations was spreading beyond her immediate unit, and not all the attention was welcome. 2 weeks after the convoy mission, Maria was summoned to a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, no relation to Colonel Hayes, despite the shared surname. Hayes commanded the entire forward operating base and had a reputation for aggressive tactics and little patience for what he considered excessive caution. He said without preamble when she reported to his office, "I've been reading about your little capture mission. Some people are calling it brilliant. Others think it was an unnecessary risk that could have gotten your entire platoon killed." Maria stood at attention, unsure whether she was being praised or reprimanded. "Sir, the tactical situation warranted." "I'm not questioning your tactics, Lieutenant," Hayes interrupted. "I'm questioning your judgment. This isn't a police action where we're trying to arrest people and read them their rights. This is a war zone. Sometimes the clean solution isn't the right solution." The implied criticism stung, but Maria had learned to control her emotional responses during tense conversations. "Sir, the intelligence gathered from those captures has already led to the discovery of 3 weapons caches and prevented at least 2 planned attacks on coalition forces." Hayes studied her with cold eyes. "That's good intelligence work, but it doesn't change the fact that you put your soldiers at unnecessary risk. In this business, Lieutenant, dead enemies can't shoot back at your people. Remember that the next time you're feeling merciful." As Maria left the colonel's office, she felt the familiar weight of walking a line between competing expectations. Some superiors valued her careful, methodical approach to complex problems. Others saw her reluctance to use maximum force as weakness or inexperience. The tension came to a head 3 months later during Operation Desert Shield, a large-scale mission to clear insurgent forces from a network of caves in the mountains south of Kabul. Maria's platoon was assigned to secure one of the smaller cave complexes, while more senior officers handled the primary objectives. The mission began smoothly. Maria's team cleared the first 3 caves without encountering resistance, recovering weapons and supplies but no personnel. It was in the 4th cave that they found something unexpected: a group of 8 civilians, including 3 children, who had been sheltering in the cave system during recent fighting in their village. The civilians were terrified, particularly the children, who appeared malnourished and showed signs of trauma. According to their story, insurgents had used their village as a base for several weeks before being driven out by coalition forces. The family had been hiding in the caves, afraid to return home because they didn't know if their village was safe. Standard protocol in such situations was to detain the civilians for questioning by intelligence specialists. But Maria could see that the children were sick and desperately needed medical attention. The nearest medical facility was back at the forward operating base, but regulations required her to complete the cave clearing operation before returning. She made a decision that would later be scrutinized by multiple levels of command. Leaving Sargent with half the platoon to finish clearing the remaining caves, Maria personally escorted the civilian family back to base for immediate medical treatment. The children received the care they needed, and the family provided valuable information about insurgent movements in their region. But Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was furious when he learned about Maria's deviation from the mission plan. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded during an emergency meeting the next morning. "You abandoned your mission to play nursemaid to a bunch of locals who might have been insurgent sympathizers for all you knew." Maria had spent the night preparing for this confrontation, but the colonel's words still hit her like physical blows. "Sir, the children required immediate medical attention. Delaying treatment could have." "Could have what?" "Could have cost us valuable intelligence if those caves had contained active insurgents. Could have compromised the entire operation if your reduced force had been overrun." The accusation was unfair. His team had successfully completed the cave clearing without incident, and the intelligence from the civilian family had proven valuable. But Maria could see that Hayes had already made up his mind about her judgment. "Sir, I evaluated the tactical situation and determined that the humanitarian concerns outweighed the minimal additional risk to the mission." "The humanitarian concerns," Hayes repeated mockingly. "Let me explain something to you, Lieutenant. Your job is to accomplish the mission and bring your soldiers home alive. Everything else is secondary. If you can't understand that, you have no business wearing those bars." The meeting ended with a formal letter of counseling in Maria's personnel file, a black mark that could affect her promotion prospects for years to come. But as she walked back to her platoon's area, she was surprised to find and several other soldiers waiting for her. "We heard what happened in there," said quietly. "We wanted you to know that every person in this platoon supports the decision you made yesterday." Nodded agreement. "I've served under a lot of officers in my time, Lieutenant. Some were brilliant tacticians, some were natural leaders, and some were just good soldiers who did their jobs competently. But you're the first one I've served under who consistently makes decisions based on what's right rather than what's easy or what looks good on paper." The support from her soldiers meant everything to Maria, but she was learning that the military, like any large organization, had competing visions of what leadership should look like. Some commanders valued innovation and moral courage. Others prioritized strict adherence to orders and maximum use of force. The dichotomy became even more apparent 2 months later when Colonel Hayes, the same officer who had encouraged Maria to pursue officer candidate school, visited their forward operating base as part of a command inspection tour. Maria was selected to brief Colonel Hayes on her platoon's recent operations, including the controversial mission where she had prioritized civilian medical care. As she stood before the woman who had become something of a mentor figure, Maria felt the weight of potentially disappointing someone whose opinion mattered deeply to her. "Lieutenant," Colonel Hayes said after reviewing Maria's operational summaries. "I've been following your career with great interest. Your tactical innovations have been noted at the highest levels of command." Maria felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. "Thank you, ma'am. I've also read Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's assessment of your performance during Operation Desert Shield. He seems to feel that your judgment regarding civilian populations may be clouded by personal sentiment rather than tactical considerations." The careful phrasing of the statement made it clear that Colonel Hayes was giving Maria an opportunity to defend her actions without directly criticizing a superior officer. "Ma'am, I believe that our tactical decisions should always consider the broader strategic implications of our actions. In counterinsurgency operations, the support of the local population is often more valuable than the elimination of enemy personnel." Colonel Hayes nodded slowly. "An interesting perspective. Tell me, Lieutenant, what do you see as your primary responsibility as an Army officer?" Maria had thought about this question countless times during her sleepless nights in Afghanistan. "Ma'am, I believe my primary responsibility is to accomplish the mission while preserving the lives and welfare of my soldiers and maintaining the moral standards that distinguish us from our enemies. And when those responsibilities conflict, ma'am, I believe that truly successful leadership finds ways to fulfill all of those responsibilities simultaneously, even when the path forward isn't immediately obvious." Colonel Hayes smiled, the first time Maria had seen her show genuine emotion during the conversation. "That's an answer that shows both wisdom and maturity, Lieutenant. The Army needs officers who understand that courage isn't just about physical bravery under fire. Sometimes the greatest courage is required to make the right decision when it's not the popular decision." As Colonel Hayes prepared to leave the base, she pulled Maria aside for a private conversation. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that your approach to leadership has been noticed by people far above Lieutenant Colonel Hayes in the chain of command. There are some who believe that the future of the Army lies with officers like you, people who understand that winning hearts and minds is just as important as winning battles." She handed Maria another business card, this one with a different title and contact information. "When your deployment ends, I'd like you to consider applying for the Advanced Military Leadership Program. It's a selective program designed to accelerate the careers of officers who show exceptional promise." Maria accepted the card with shaking hands. The Advanced Military Leadership Program was legendary among junior officers, a fast track to senior leadership positions that typically led to assignments at the Pentagon and eventually to command positions at the highest levels of the Army. "Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility." Colonel Hayes studied her with the same penetrating gaze Maria remembered from their first meeting years earlier. "Lieutenant, let me share something I learned early in my career. The officers who are most reluctant to seek power are often the ones who can be trusted with it. Your reluctance isn't a weakness. It's evidence of the kind of moral character the Army desperately needs in its senior leadership." That evening, Maria sat in her makeshift office area, staring at Colonel Hayes's business card while composing her weekly letter home to her mother. She thought about the 18-year-old girl who had arrived at Fort with nothing but determination and a dream of stable employment. That girl could never have imagined sitting in a forward operating base in Afghanistan, being recruited for elite leadership programs by some of the most powerful people in the American military. But she also thought about Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's cold assessment of her performance and the delicate balance she had to maintain between competing expectations of what an Army officer should be. The path ahead was becoming clearer, but it was also becoming more challenging. As she began writing her letter, Maria realized that her mother's prediction had come true. She was no longer following a path that others had made. She was beginning to create the path that others would follow. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating, but she was no longer the frightened girl who had once believed that safety lay in remaining invisible. The next morning brought news of her promotion to captain and orders to return to the United States for advanced training. As her platoon prepared to rotate back to their home base, approached her with an envelope signed by every soldier in the unit. "We wanted you to have this before we all go our separate ways," he said gruffly. "Most of us will probably serve under a dozen different officers before we retire, but we'll always remember serving under the one who taught us that being a good soldier and being a good person aren't mutually exclusive." Maria opened the envelope to find a photograph of her entire platoon, along with individual notes from each soldier thanking her for her leadership and expressing confidence in her future success. As she read through the heartfelt messages, she felt the final piece of her transformation clicking into place. The quiet girl from East Los Angeles was gone, replaced by a confident young officer who had learned to trust her own judgment even when it conflicted with conventional wisdom. The path ahead would bring even greater challenges, but Maria was no longer afraid of standing in the spotlight if it meant she could light the way for others to follow. 15 years after her first deployment to Afghanistan, Colonel Maria stood before the mirror in her Pentagon office, adjusting the eagles on her collar for what would be her final day in this rank. Tomorrow's ceremony would pin 4 stars on her shoulders, making her the youngest Latina general in United States Army history. The reflection staring back at her showed the accumulated weight of years spent leading soldiers through some of the most challenging conflicts of the 21st century. Gray threads had begun appearing in her dark hair, and small lines around her eyes spoke to countless nights spent making decisions that affected thousands of lives. But her posture remained straight, and her gaze steady. The same determination that had carried her from the streets of East Los Angeles now focused on challenges she could never have imagined as a young recruit. The phone on her desk buzzed with an encrypted call from General Hayes, now serving as the Army Chief of Staff and one of the most powerful military leaders in the world. Their relationship had evolved from mentor and to trusted colleagues, though Colonel Hayes's guidance remained invaluable as Maria navigated the complex politics of senior military leadership. "Maria, congratulations on tomorrow's promotion," General Hayes said warmly. "I wanted to call personally before the ceremony becomes a circus of politicians and media attention." Maria settled into her chair, grateful for a moment of genuine conversation before the day's meetings began. "Thank you. I have to admit, part of me still feels like that scared recruit who didn't think she belonged in officer candidate school." General Hayes laughed softly. "Good. The day you stop questioning whether you deserve to be where you are is the day you become dangerous to the people you lead. Doubt keeps you humble, and humility is what separates true leaders from those who simply enjoy the privileges of rank." The conversation turned to Maria's new assignment as commander of the Joint Task Force for Global Security Operations, a position that would place her at the center of international military cooperation efforts. It was a role that required not just tactical expertise, but diplomatic skills and the ability to work with military leaders from dozens of different countries and cultural backgrounds. "You'll be facing challenges that none of us could have prepared you for in traditional military training," General Hayes continued. "The enemies we're fighting now don't wear uniforms or follow conventional rules of warfare. You'll need to think like a diplomat, a strategist, and a humanitarian all at the same time." After ending the call, Maria turned her attention to the stack of briefing materials that would consume her morning. The first item was a situation report from Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer, Jessica's daughter, and the latest generation of the family to serve with distinction. The young officer commanded a special operations unit working to disrupt human trafficking networks in Eastern Europe, a mission that perfectly the new kinds of challenges facing modern military leaders. Lieutenant Colonel's report detailed a complex operation that had rescued 43 victims of forced labor while gathering intelligence about criminal organizations operating across international borders. The mission required coordination between American special forces, European law enforcement agencies, and humanitarian organizations, exactly the kind of multifaceted challenge that Maria would be handling as a 4-star general. The briefing reminded Maria of her own evolution from a tactical leader focused on immediate battlefield challenges to a strategic thinker responsible for global operations affecting millions of people. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. It had required years of study, mentorship, and gradually expanding responsibilities that tested her ability to see beyond immediate problems to their larger implications. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock on her office door. "Enter," she called, and was surprised to see Sergeant Major Michael, now serving as the senior enlisted advisor to the Pentagon's Special Operations Command. "Good morning, Colonel," said with the same gruff warmth that had characterized their relationship since Afghanistan. "I wanted to stop by before tomorrow's ceremony to offer my congratulations personally." Maria stood to greet the man who had been her first senior non-commissioned officer and remained one of her most trusted advisors. "Michael, thank you for coming. I know how busy your schedule is." His weathered face showed genuine emotion as he spoke. "General, do you remember what I told you after that first convoy mission in Afghanistan? About how I thought I'd be babysitting some college kid playing soldier?" Maria smiled at the memory. "You said I proved you wrong about my capabilities." "I did say that, but I was wrong about something else too. I thought proving myself wrong about your tactical abilities was the important part. But looking back now, what really mattered was that you proved it was possible to lead with both strength and compassion. You showed an entire generation of soldiers that tough decisions don't have to be cruel decisions." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a letter from Staff Sergeant you remember from our platoon. She's retiring next month after 25 years of service. She wanted me to give you this personally." Maria unfolded the letter and read neat handwriting. "General, thank you for showing me that a woman could lead soldiers without having to become someone she wasn't. Because of your example, I never felt like I had to choose between being effective and being human. You made it possible for all of us who followed in your footsteps." The letter continued with updates about his family and career, but it was the opening sentiment that struck Maria most deeply. Throughout her rise through the ranks, she had often wondered whether her approach to leadership was truly effective or if she was simply fortunate to have served under commanders who appreciated her style. This letter, along with dozens of others Maria had received from former subordinates over the years, provided clear evidence that her leadership philosophy had influenced an entire generation of military personnel. Officers who had served under her command were now leading their own units with the same emphasis on moral courage and innovative thinking that she had tried to model. The afternoon brought a meeting that would test those very principles in ways Maria could never have anticipated. She was called to an urgent briefing about a developing crisis in Southeast Asia, where ethnic conflicts were threatening to destabilize an entire region and potentially disrupt global shipping routes critical to international trade. The Situation Room was filled with senior military leaders, State Department officials, and intelligence analysts. On the main screen, satellite images showed refugee camps swelling with displaced civilians while armed militias controlled key transportation corridors. General Robert, Jessica's father and now serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, outlined the strategic implications of the crisis. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly. We have 3 major powers positioning naval assets in the region, and any one of them could spark a larger conflict if they decide to intervene unilaterally." The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of modern military leadership. Traditional military solutions, deployment of combat forces to restore order, would likely escalate the situation and potentially trigger the larger conflict they were trying to prevent. But allowing the crisis to continue would result in massive humanitarian suffering and could still lead to military confrontation as regional powers competed for influence. Maria listened carefully to the various perspectives being presented, drawing on 15 years of experience in similar situations. She had learned that the most effective solutions often came from combining military capabilities with diplomatic initiatives and humanitarian assistance in ways that addressed root causes rather than just immediate symptoms. "General," the Secretary of Defense said, turning to her directly, "you'll be taking command of the Joint Task Force next week. We need your assessment of how to approach this situation." Maria stood and moved to the front of the room, studying the satellite images and intelligence summaries displayed on the screens around her. The faces looking back at her represented decades of military experience and political wisdom, but she could see that conventional thinking wasn't providing clear answers to this unconventional challenge. "Mr. Secretary, based on the intelligence presented, I believe we're looking at this crisis through the wrong lens. We're trying to solve a humanitarian disaster using tools designed for military conflicts, when what we actually need is a coordinated response that treats the refugee crisis as the primary threat to regional stability." She moved to the map display and highlighted several key areas. "If we focus our initial efforts on establishing secure humanitarian corridors and refugee processing centers, we can reduce the pressure on national governments while creating space for diplomatic solutions to the underlying ethnic conflicts." The approach she outlined involved positioning military assets to protect humanitarian operations rather than to threaten potential adversaries. It was a strategy that prioritized long-term stability over short-term demonstrations of force, but it required convincing allied nations to coordinate their responses instead of competing for unilateral advantage. General leaned forward with interest. That's an innovative approach, but it requires a level of international cooperation that we've struggled to achieve in previous crises. What makes you think this situation will be different? Maria had anticipated this question, and her answer drew on years of experience building relationships with military leaders from dozens of countries. Sir, I believe the key difference is that we're not asking other nations to subordinate their interests to ours. Instead, we're proposing a framework where every participant gains something valuable: reduced refugee pressure on their borders, enhanced regional stability, and shared influence in shaping the long-term solution. The discussion continued for 2 hours, with various officials raising practical concerns about logistics, political feasibility, and potential risks. But by the end of the meeting, there was consensus that Maria's approach represented the best available option for managing a crisis that had no purely military solution. As the meeting concluded, the Secretary of Defense asked Maria to remain behind for a private conversation. General, I want you to understand that implementing this strategy will place enormous pressure on your leadership. You'll be managing not just American forces, but coordinating with military and civilian leaders from a dozen different countries, each with their own political pressures and strategic objectives. Maria nodded her understanding. Mr. Secretary, I've learned that the most challenging leadership situations are often the most important ones. If we can demonstrate that international cooperation is possible in this crisis, it creates a model for addressing future challenges before they escalate to open conflict. The Secretary studied her carefully. You're taking on a role that will define not just your own legacy, but potentially the future of international military cooperation. Are you ready for that responsibility? The question reminded Maria of similar conversations she had experienced at every major transition in her career, moments when she was asked to step into roles that seemed impossibly large and important. Each time, she had felt the same mixture of excitement and terror, the same sense of being handed responsibilities that could either elevate her or destroy her. But she had also learned that readiness wasn't about feeling completely prepared for every possible challenge. True readiness came from having the intellectual humility to continue learning, the moral courage to make difficult decisions, and the emotional resilience to persist through setbacks and criticism. Mr. Secretary, I believe I am ready. More importantly, I believe the team I'll be working with is ready. The modern military has developed a generation of leaders who understand that our greatest strength comes from our ability to work with others, not our ability to dominate them. The next morning dawned crisp and clear for Maria's promotion ceremony. As she stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by the portraits of Medal of Honor recipients and the flags representing every major military campaign in American history, she felt the weight of joining an institution that had shaped world events for more than 2 centuries. Her mother, now 73 years old but still sharp and elegant in her best dress, sat in the front row next to Carlos, who had followed his own path to success as a high school principal in their old neighborhood. Eyes shone with tears as she watched her daughter receive the 4 stars that represented the pinnacle of military achievement. General Hayes conducted the promotion ceremony with the same blend of warmth and gravitas that had characterized their relationship for nearly 2 decades. It is my honor to promote Colonel Maria to the rank of General United States Army, she announced to the assembled crowd of military officials, political leaders, and family members. As the 4 stars were pinned to her shoulders, Maria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She remembered the frightened teenager who had walked through the gates of Fort with nothing but determination and dreams. She remembered the young lieutenant learning to lead soldiers in the mountains of Afghanistan. She remembered the colonel struggling to balance competing demands for moral leadership and tactical effectiveness. But most of all, she remembered the people who had helped shape her understanding of what leadership really meant. Sergeant teaching her to earn respect through competence and character. Colonel Hayes showing her that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Her mother demonstrating that courage meant fighting for something bigger than yourself, even when the odds seemed impossible. During her speech following the promotion ceremony, Maria addressed not just the distinguished audience gathered in the Hall of Heroes, but the thousands of soldiers around the world who would look to her for leadership in the challenging years ahead. Today I accept not just the privilege of wearing these 4 stars, but the responsibility to serve every soldier who has ever taught me that true leadership means creating opportunities for others to succeed. The young woman who walked into basic training 20 years ago believed that survival meant staying invisible and avoiding risks. The general standing before you today understands that the greatest risk is failing to use whatever influence we have to make the world better for those who will come after us. She paused to look directly at her mother, whose smile conveyed 20 years of pride and worry and unconditional love. I stand here today because people believed in me before I believed in myself. My commitment is to extend that same faith to every soldier I have the honor to lead. The ceremony concluded with Maria receiving her first briefing as a 4-star general about the Southeast Asia crisis that would define the early months of her new command. As she reviewed the operational plans that her staff had developed based on her humanitarian-focused strategy, she felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that accompanied every new challenge. But there was something else as well, a deep sense of confidence that came not from believing she had all the answers, but from knowing she had the character and capabilities to find the right answers when they mattered most. The scared recruit from East Los Angels had become a general who would shape international military policy for years to come. 3 months later, as Maria stood in a refugee camp in Southeast Asia, watching her humanitarian corridors successfully process thousands of displaced families, while her diplomatic teams worked to negotiate permanent settlements for the underlying ethnic conflicts, she reflected on the phone call that had changed everything. General Hayes had been right about the complexity of the challenges she would face. Coordinating military forces from 12 different countries while managing humanitarian operations and facilitating peace negotiations required skills that no military academy could teach. But the foundation of moral leadership and innovative thinking that Maria had built throughout her career provided the framework for tackling problems that had no precedent and no clear solutions. As she watched American, European, and Asian soldiers working together to distribute supplies and maintain security for vulnerable civilians, Maria understood that her greatest contribution to military history might not be any single battle won or crisis resolved. Instead, it might be demonstrating that military leadership in the 21st century required the ability to think beyond traditional concepts of victory and defeat. The scared teenager who had once believed that standing out meant becoming a target had learned to use her visibility to light the path for others to follow. The general who had once worried about proving she belonged was now focused on creating space for others to discover their own potential for greatness. That evening, as Maria composed her weekly letter to her mother, a tradition she had maintained throughout her military career, she reflected on his prediction that some people are born to make the path for others to follow. 20 years later, surrounded by the evidence of lives changed and possibilities created through her leadership, Maria finally understood what her mother had seen in her from the beginning. The 4 stars on her shoulders represented more than personal achievement or professional recognition. They represented the collective hopes of every soldier who had ever struggled to balance strength with compassion, effectiveness with humanity, success with integrity. And they represented the promise that leadership based on moral courage rather than simple ambition could still change the world, one decision at a time.